Chapter 1. The Shrouded Arrival. The small motorboat rocked violently as it struggled through the churning waters. Each wave struck the hull like a hammer, sending sprays of icy salt water over the bow. Nathaniel Graves clutched the railing with white-knuckled hands, his face pale under the overcast sky. He had never been a seafaring man. His life had been spent in the quiet safety of dusty libraries and dim offices. The ocean was an alien beast to him, untamed and indifferent. Ahead, through the thickening fog, the jagged silhouette of Blackthorn Island emerged like a phantom. The lighthouse stood at its center, a towering monolith against the gray horizon. Its beams swept lazily across the water, piercing the mist with an eerie, mechanical precision. The boatman, a grizzled man who introduced himself only as Harris, grunted as he cut the engine. "There she is. Blackthorn Light. Been keepin' sailors off the rocks for over 100 years. Hope you're ready for her." Nathaniel swallowed hard and nodded. "It's impressive," he said, though the sight filled him with unease. The lighthouse seemed less like a beacon of hope and more like a sentinel, guarding something it had no intention of letting escape. Harris chuckled darkly. "Impressive ain't the word I'd use. Folks round here call it cursed." "Cursed?" Nathaniel asked, his voice thin against the roar of the waves. "Aye. Last keeper went mad. Before him, another died in a storm, or so they say. All kinds of stories about Blackthorn. Enough to keep me away, that's for sure." Harris spat into the sea and began hauling a rope. "But you'll see for yourself soon enough." The boat docked with a bone-jarring thud against the rickety pier. Nathaniel clambered onto the slippery planks, his boots sinking into the mossy wood. He turned to thank Harris, but the man was already reversing the boat, eager to leave the island behind. "Good luck, keeper," Harris called over the roar of the engine. "You'll need it." The boat disappeared into the fog, leaving Nathaniel alone. The air was colder here, thick with the smell of salt and decay. He hoisted his bag onto his shoulder and began the steep climb up the rocky path toward the lighthouse. The wind howled around him, carrying whispers that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the island were resisting his presence. At the top of the hill, the lighthouse loomed. Its white paint was chipped and weathered, revealing the dark stone beneath. The windows glared down at him like hollow eyes. A rusted iron door marked the entrance, its surface scarred with deep scratches. Nathaniel hesitated before reaching for the key Harris had given him. The metal was cold against his palm. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow hallway that smelled of damp and oil. The air inside was still, oppressive. Nathaniel's footsteps echoed as he stepped over the threshold. The walls were lined with faded photographs of previous keepers, their stern faces staring out from another time. He felt their eyes on him as he moved deeper into the lighthouse. The living quarters were small but functional. A wooden table, a single chair, a narrow bed with a threadbare quilt. A stove sat in the corner, along with a stack of logs that looked suspiciously damp. A spiral staircase wound upward, leading to the lamp room. Nathaniel set his bag down and lit a lantern, the flame casting flickering shadows across the walls. As he unpacked, he found a journal left by the previous keeper. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The first entry was dated 2 years prior. "Arrived at Blackthorn today. The isolation is palpable. The light is steady, at least. I hope it remains so." Nathaniel flipped through the pages, the handwriting growing more erratic as the entries progressed. The final entry sent a chill down his spine. "The light is no longer mine alone. I see it now, watching me, always watching. I cannot." The rest was illegible, the ink smudged as if by a trembling hand. Nathaniel closed the journal and placed it on the table, his chest tight. The wind howled louder outside, rattling the windows. He told himself it was only the storm, but the sound seemed to form words, faint and indistinct. He shook his head, willing the thought away. That night, as he lay in bed, the lighthouse groaned and creaked like a living thing. The beam of light swept rhythmically across the darkness, but each time it passed the window, Nathaniel felt a peculiar unease. It was as if something out there was waiting for the light to leave it in shadow. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with thoughts of the journal and Harris's words. Hours passed, marked only by the relentless cadence of the foghorn. Just as he began to drift off, a faint sound reached his ears, a whisper, low and guttural, coming from somewhere above. He sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called into the silence. Only the wind answered, its wail rising to a crescendo. Clutching the lantern, Nathaniel climbed the spiral staircase, each step a protest from the iron beneath his feet. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. At the top, the lamp room was empty, its great glass lens turning smoothly. The whisper stopped the moment he entered. For a long moment, he stood there, listening to the rhythmic hum of the machinery. Then, just as he turned to leave, the light flickered. A shadow darted across the room, gone in an instant. Nathaniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. The lamp stabilized, its beam steady once more. But the room felt colder, and the whispers, they were closer now. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Fog. The morning came shrouded in gray, the sun a pale smear against the unbroken fog. Nathaniel stirred from a restless sleep, his limbs heavy and his mind clouded. The memory of the previous night clung to him like a damp shroud. The whispers, the flickering light, the shadow that had darted across the lamp room, they gnawed at the edges of his reason. He told himself it had been a trick of the mind, the product of exhaustion and the island's oppressive solitude. But deep down, a seed of unease had taken root. He dressed quickly, the cold biting through his woolen sweater, and climbed the spiral staircase to check the lamp. The glass lens gleamed in the pale light, its mechanisms turning with a steady rhythm. Everything seemed in order. Yet as he cleaned the surface and inspected the machinery, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation pricked at the back of his neck, sharp and insistent. The foghorn let out a mournful wail, a sound that resonated deep within his chest. Nathaniel stepped out onto the narrow walkway encircling the lamp room. The world below was an indistinct blur, the sea and sky merging into a void of shifting gray. The island's jagged rocks jutted like skeletal remains from the water, their shapes barely discernible through the mist. The air was thick with moisture, each breath heavy in his lungs. As he leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon, he noticed something unusual, a faint, rhythmic movement at the edge of the fog. It could have been the waves, but the motion was too regular, too deliberate. He strained to see, his heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the movement vanished, swallowed by the mist. Nathaniel retreated inside, locking the door behind him. He busied himself with his duties, cataloging supplies and recording the weather in the logbook. The routine offered a small measure of comfort, a tether to normalcy in a place that seemed intent on unraveling his sanity. But even as he worked, the whispers lingered in his mind, faint and insistent, like a melody he couldn't quite place. By midday, he found himself drawn to the small library tucked into a corner of the living quarters. Shelves of weathered books lined the walls, their spines faded and cracked. Many were technical manuals and maritime logs, but there were also volumes of poetry, local folklore, and journals left by previous keepers. Nathaniel pulled one of these from the shelf, its cover embossed with the initials ER. The journal belonged to a man named Edgar Rollins, who had served as keeper decades ago. The entries began with practical details, weather patterns, maintenance records, notes on passing ships. But as Nathaniel read on, the tone grew darker, more introspective. The light is eternal, one entry read. Yet in its constancy lies a cruel irony. It illuminates the world, but leaves me in shadow. The isolation gnaws at my mind, and the whispers grow louder with each passing day. Nathaniel frowned, the words striking an unsettling chord. He flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening as he uncovered more references to the whispers and the shadow. The final entry was brief, the handwriting jagged and desperate. The fog holds secrets. Beware the echoes. A sudden knock at the door startled him, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. Nathaniel's heart leapt into his throat. He set the journal aside and approached the door cautiously, his hand trembling as he turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. The walkway was empty, the fog dense and impenetrable. The knock echoed in his mind, a phantom sound that refused to be dismissed. He closed the door and bolted it, his nerves fraying. To calm himself, he brewed a pot of tea, the ritual offering a semblance of comfort. As the water boiled and the scent of dried leaves filled the air, he tried to focus on the warmth of the mug in his hands, the simplicity of the moment. But the silence was oppressive, a void that amplified every creak and groan of the old lighthouse. As the afternoon waned, Nathaniel ventured outside to inspect the generator. The fog had thickened, muffling sound and distorting shapes. Each step felt like an intrusion, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing unnaturally. The generator shed was a short walk from the lighthouse, nestled among the rocks. The structure was weather-beaten, its door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of oil. The generator hummed steadily, its vibrations reverberating through the floor. Nathaniel checked the fuel levels and tightened a few loose bolts, his movements mechanical. As he worked, he became aware of a faint sound outside, a low murmur that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. He paused, his hand frozen on a wrench. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, speaking words he couldn't understand. Nathaniel's throat tightened as he stepped to the door and peered into the fog. There was no one there, only the swirling gray. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, a dark shape moving with unsettling fluidity. Nathaniel stumbled back, his pulse thundering in his ears. The figure stopped, its outline barely visible. For a long moment, they stared at each other, though Nathaniel couldn't make out any features. Then, as if carried on the wind, a whisper reached him. "Leave." The figure dissolved into the fog, leaving Nathaniel trembling in the doorway. He hurried back to the lighthouse, his mind racing. He bolted the door behind him and leaned against it, his breath ragged. The island seemed to close in around him, the fog a living entity that watched and waited. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seeped through the walls, threading through his thoughts. Nathaniel sat at the table, the journal open before him, the words blurring as his vision swam. The foghorn wailed, a mournful dirge that seemed to echo his growing despair. And in the stillness, the knock came again. Chapter 3. The Keeper's Diary. The knock reverberated through the lighthouse like a cannon shot, rattling Nathaniel's already fragile composure. He froze, the journal slipping from his hands and landing on the floor with a muted thud. For several seconds, he did nothing, his body rigid, his breath caught somewhere between inhalation and exhalation. The knock came again, softer this time but no less insistent, like the beat of a heart against the door. Summoning what courage he could muster, Nathaniel grabbed a lantern and approached the door. His hand hovered over the latch, trembling with hesitation. Was it the fog playing tricks? A desperate wanderer seeking refuge? Or something worse? He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear beyond the howling wind. The silence was deafening. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, he threw the door open. The fog surged inward like a living thing, curling around his boots and licking at the threshold. Beyond it, there was nothing but the swirling gray, the world beyond reduced to a void. Nathaniel stepped out, holding the lantern high. The faint circle of light barely penetrated the mist. "Hello?" he called, his voice thin and wavering. "Is anyone there?" No answer came, only the mournful cry of the foghorn in the distance. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the chills seeping into his bones, before retreating inside and bolting the door. His mind churned with questions and doubts. Had he truly heard the knock, or was it another trick of isolation? He returned to the table, where the journal lay open to its final, ominous entry. The words, "Beware the echoes," seemed to leap off the page, pulsing with a sinister rhythm. He closed the book and pushed it aside, unwilling to confront its implications. Instead, he turned his attention to the lighthouse's logs. The keepers before him had meticulously recorded their daily routines, the weather, and any passing ships. Nathaniel hoped to find something mundane, something to ground him in reality. But as he flipped through the pages, an unsettling pattern emerged. Several entries referenced strange occurrences. Lights seen in the fog where no ship should be, disembodied voices carried on the wind, and fleeting shadows that seemed to vanish upon closer inspection. The accounts grew more erratic with time, the handwriting devolving into scrawls. The final entry in one log was a single, jagged line. Asterisk, "The light deceives." A shiver ran down Nathaniel's spine. He pushed the logs away and rose from the table, pacing the small room. The walls felt as if they were closing in, the air thick with an unseen weight. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, threading through the silence like a needle through cloth. Desperate for distraction, he decided to explore the rest of the lighthouse. He grabbed the lantern and ascended the spiral staircase, the iron steps groaning under his weight. The lamp room was as he had left it, the great Fresnel lens casting its steady beam out into the void. He checked the mechanisms again, finding them in perfect order. But the unease lingered, a gnawing presence he couldn't shake. From the lamp room, he ventured onto the narrow walkway encircling it. The fog was thicker than ever, a suffocating blanket that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The sound of the waves was muted, as if the ocean itself had withdrawn. Nathaniel leaned against the railing, staring into the gray, his thoughts a tangled mess. A movement below caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fog, but then it happened again. A shadow flitting across the rocks near the base of the lighthouse. He squinted, straining to see. The shadow moved with purpose, darting between the jagged outcroppings before disappearing into the mist. Nathaniel's grip on the railing tightened. He felt an almost magnetic pull, a compulsion to descend and investigate. But a stronger instinct, one born of fear, kept him rooted in place. He watched the spot where the shadow had vanished, his heart pounding. When it didn't reappear, he retreated inside, bolting the door behind him. The hours dragged on, each one more oppressive than the last. Nathaniel tried to busy himself with maintenance tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting to the shadow, the whispers, the knock. The lighthouse, once a beacon of safety, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to hum with an energy of their own, the air vibrating with tension. Night fell quickly, the darkness absolute. Nathaniel lit the oil lamps, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows. He sat at the table, staring at the journal, the logs, the scattered papers. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, their cadence hypnotic. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Nathaniel jumped to his feet, the lantern's flame wavering. The sound had come from the storeroom. He hesitated, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay put. But curiosity and duty drove him forward. He grabbed the lantern and made his way to the storeroom, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The door to the storeroom was ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. Nathaniel pushed it open, the lantern's light spilling into the space. Supplies were scattered across the floor, cans of oil, coils of rope, and boxes of tools. At first glance, it seemed as if they had fallen from a shelf. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the debris were footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading deeper into the storeroom. They were bare, the toes elongated and splayed in a way that didn't look entirely human. Nathaniel followed them with the lantern, each step an act of defiance against the primal fear clawing at his mind. The footprints ended abruptly at the far wall. Nathaniel ran his hand along the surface, feeling for a hidden door or panel, but found nothing. He stepped back, his mind racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, as if in answer to an unspoken question, the lantern flickered and went out. In the suffocating darkness, Nathaniel felt something brush against his shoulder. He turned, his breath caught in his throat, but saw nothing. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter. It was a low, guttural noise, filled with malice. Nathaniel stumbled out of the storeroom, his heart pounding. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, his chest heaving. The lighthouse seemed alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen force. The whispers followed him back to the living quarters, where he huddled in a corner, clutching the extinguished lantern like a talisman. The night stretched on, endless and unrelenting, and somewhere in the fog, the shadow waited. Chapter 4: Whispers in the Light. Dawn arrived reluctantly, casting pale, gray light across the island. The fog had thinned slightly, but its oppressive presence lingered like a malevolent spirit. Nathaniel had spent the night in the living quarters, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, the extinguished lantern clutched tightly in his hands. His mind churned with the memory of the laughter, the unnatural footprints, and the touch that had sent shivers down his spine. He hadn't dared to return to the storeroom, and sleep had eluded him entirely. As the dim light filtered through the small, salt-streaked window, Nathaniel forced himself to move. His limbs were stiff, his muscles protesting every motion. He set the lantern on the table and checked its oil level, his hands trembling. The simple act of maintenance offered a fleeting sense of normalcy. He lit the lantern, grateful for its warm, steady glow, and set about preparing a modest breakfast from the dwindling supplies in the pantry. As he ate, his thoughts returned to the footprints. They couldn't have been his own. He hadn't been barefoot, and their shape was all wrong. He mulled over the possibilities. An intruder, an animal, or perhaps something else entirely. Each explanation seemed more improbable than the last, yet he couldn't deny what he had seen. The whispers, those insidious, unintelligible murmurs, continued to echo in his mind. After finishing his meal, Nathaniel resolved to confront his fears head-on. He needed answers, and the only way to find them was to investigate further. He retrieved a crowbar from the tool rack and returned to the storeroom. The air grew colder as he approached, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He hesitated, gripping the crowbar tightly, before unbolting the door and stepping inside. The storeroom was just as he had left it, disheveled, with supplies scattered across the floor. The footprints were still there, faint but visible, leading to the wall at the far end. Nathaniel knelt to examine them more closely, noting the odd, claw-like impressions at the toes. They seemed too deliberate to be the result of an animal. He ran his hand along the wall again, searching for any irregularities. His fingers brushed against a seam in the stone, barely perceptible. Heart pounding, he wedged the crowbar into the seam and pried it open. The section of wall shifted with a grinding noise, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that descended into the earth. A cold draft wafted up from the opening, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Nathaniel hesitated. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to seal the passage and forget it existed, but his curiosity and a strange, almost magnetic pull urged him onward. He grabbed the lantern and stepped into the passage, the crowbar tucked under his arm. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls narrowed around him, pressing in like the jaws of some great beast. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber, its walls lined with crude, uneven stones. In the center of the room was a rusted iron grate, partially obscured by a layer of grime and debris. Nathaniel's lantern cast long shadows across the room, making the space feel larger and more menacing than it was. He knelt by the grate, wiping away the dirt to reveal intricate carvings etched into the metal. The symbols were unfamiliar, their angular lines and swirling curves evoking a sense of unease. As he studied them, the whispers returned, louder and more coherent than before. They seemed to emanate from the grate itself, weaving together in a haunting chant that sent chills down his spine. Nathaniel's breath quickened. He reached for the crowbar, intending to pry the grate open, but stopped short. A part of him, the part still clinging to reason, warned against disturbing whatever lay beneath. But the whispers grew more insistent, their tone shifting from pleading to commanding. "What do you want?" Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The whispers paused, as if considering his question, before resuming with greater intensity. The lantern flickered, its flame wavering as if caught in a phantom wind. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the passage, shaking the chamber. Nathaniel spun around, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. The noise had come from above, near the entrance to the passage. Panic surged through him as he realized the weight of the stone slab might have shifted, threatening to seal him inside. He scrambled back up the passage, his heart hammering. As he neared the storeroom, he saw that the door to the passage had indeed shifted, the slab now ajar at a precarious angle. He shoved it open with all his strength, the effort leaving him gasping for breath. Emerging into the storeroom, he bolted the door to the passage and leaned against it, his chest heaving. The whispers had stopped, but their memory lingered, a ghostly echo in his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore the passage or the chamber beneath the lighthouse, but for now, he needed to regroup. Nathaniel spent the rest of the day fortifying the storeroom, stacking crates and barrels against the door to the passage. He checked the lighthouse's mechanisms obsessively, ensuring everything was in working order. As night fell, the fog thickened once more, wrapping the island in an impenetrable shroud. He lit the oil lamps and settled into the living quarters, his nerves frayed. The journal, the logs, and the scattered papers lay untouched on the table, their secrets waiting to be uncovered. But Nathaniel couldn't bring himself to read them. Instead, he stared into the lantern's flame, its steady light a fragile comfort against the encroaching darkness. As the hours stretched on, the whispers returned, faint but persistent. This time, they seemed to come from within the lighthouse itself, threading through the walls and floor like roots. Nathaniel closed his eyes, gripping the arms of the chair, as the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred once more. Chapter 5. The Watcher in the Shadows. The fog clung to the lighthouse like a living thing, its tendrils slithering through cracks and gaps, muffling the world beyond. Nathaniel stood at the base of the tower, staring out at the ghostly expanse. He hadn't ventured outside since the discovery of the hidden passage, but now he felt compelled. The air within the lighthouse had grown suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. With a lantern in one hand and a knife tucked into his belt, Nathaniel stepped onto the narrow path that circled the island. The sea roared below, its waves battering the jagged rocks. The lighthouse loomed behind him, its towering silhouette shrouded in mist. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were pulling him back. He stopped at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the churning waters. The fog distorted everything, turning the ocean into a swirling void. Nathaniel's gaze drifted to the horizon, or where the horizon should have been. It was as if the island existed in a world of its own, cut off from time and space. A sound broke the oppressive silence, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the sea itself. Nathaniel froze, his pulse quickening. The sound came again, louder this time, carrying a desperate, almost human quality. He scanned the waters but saw nothing. The lantern's feeble light barely pierced the fog, and the knife at his side felt woefully inadequate. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The whale answered, closer now. It wasn't the wind or the waves. It was something else entirely. Nathaniel's thoughts raced. Was it a survivor, someone stranded like him? Or was it another cruel trick of the fog, a hallucination born of his growing paranoia? He took a hesitant step closer to the edge, peering into the abyss. The wailing ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Nathaniel turned to head back to the lighthouse, but the path seemed unfamiliar, the terrain shifting subtly under his feet. The fog thickened, swallowing the faint trail. Panic surged through him as he realized he was lost. The lighthouse, his one beacon of safety, had vanished from view. A rustling noise caught his attention. He spun around, raising the lantern. The light illuminated a gnarled tree, its twisted branches clawing at the air. Beneath it, the ground appeared disturbed, as if something had been buried there. Nathaniel approached cautiously, the lantern casting flickering shadows across the dirt. He knelt and brushed away the loose soil, revealing a fragment of wood. Digging deeper, he unearthed a weathered sign. The letters were barely legible, but he could make out the words, "Keepers never leave." A shiver ran down his spine. The message felt like a warning, a grim prophecy etched into the land itself. He clutched the sign, his mind racing. What had happened to the previous keepers? Had they succumbed to the same madness that now gnawed at him? The wailing returned, louder and more urgent. This time, it was accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the gravel. Nathaniel rose to his feet, gripping the lantern tightly. "Who's there?" he called again, his voice echoing into the void. A figure emerged from the fog, its form distorted and shifting. At first, it appeared human, but as it drew closer, Nathaniel's breath caught. The figure's features were indistinct, its body translucent. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as though it were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Nathaniel stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. The figure stopped a few feet away, its head cocked to one side. It raised an arm, pointing toward the lighthouse. Nathaniel's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a suffocating force that pressed against his chest. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving behind only the echo of its footsteps. Nathaniel stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand. He turned and fled, his feet pounding the uneven ground. The path twisted and turned, and he ran blindly, desperate to find his way back. When he finally reached the lighthouse, he slammed the door shut behind him, bolting it with trembling hands. His chest heaved as he leaned against the door, the lantern's light casting wild shadows across the room. The whispers began anew, faint and insistent, threading through the walls like a living thing. Nathaniel staggered to the table and grabbed the journal. He flipped through its pages, searching for answers. The entries grew more erratic as he read, the handwriting becoming jagged and frenzied. One passage caught his eye. The fog is alive. It watches, it waits. The keepers are its prey, its prisoners. There is no escape, only surrender. He slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding. The words felt like a confirmation of his worst fears. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a force, a malevolent entity that ensnared its victims. The lantern flickered, its flame sputtering as if in protest. Nathaniel's gaze darted to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, undulating like a living thing. He could feel it watching him, its presence suffocating and inescapable. As the whispers grew louder, Nathaniel clung to the lantern, its light his only solace in the encroaching darkness. The lighthouse groaned, its walls trembling as if under the weight of an unseen force. The fog's embrace tightened, and Nathaniel realized he was no longer just a keeper of the light. He was its prisoner. Chapter 6. The Silent Storm. The wind howled outside, a continuous wail that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. It pressed against the lighthouse like an invisible force, pushing against the stone walls as if it wanted to tear the place apart. The sea roared in the distance, its waves crashing against the rocks below with an intensity that rattled the windows, sending shivers through the young keeper's bones. Inside, the flickering flame of the lantern barely illuminated the room. A soft, inconsistent pulse of light danced on the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. Elias sat by the small desk in the corner of the keeper's quarters, his hands trembling slightly as he wrote in the logbook. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he could not bring himself to close them. He could feel the presence of something in the room, something that wasn't quite right. The silence, when it fell, felt like a living thing, wrapping around him, tightening, until it was almost suffocating. He had grown used to the isolation, but now, with each passing day, the weight of the emptiness seemed heavier, more oppressive. He glanced out the small window, the fog thick and unyielding, a wall of white that swallowed the horizon. The boat had not arrived in days, and he had heard nothing from the mainland. The communication lines were down, the storm cutting him off from the rest of the world. It was as if the island had chosen him to be its last inhabitant, forever bound to the endless cycle of its haunting stillness. A faint sound broke through the silence, a soft tapping from the direction of the lighthouse tower. Elias tensed, his heart skipping a beat. He had heard it before, in the dead of night, but always in the periphery of his mind, easily dismissed as the creaking of the old buildings settling. But tonight, the tapping was different. It was persistent, deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. Slowly, he rose from his chair, the chill in the air biting at his skin as he made his way toward the tower. Each step echoed loudly in the empty hall, reverberating off the walls and into the very marrow of his bones. The staircase spiraled upward in front of him, dark and foreboding, as if it were daring him to climb. The tapping continued, a rhythmic beat that grew louder with each step he took. It was now unmistakable. Someone was up there. But how? The thought gripped him with a sudden panic. He had been alone for days. The other keeper, the one before him, had disappeared without a trace. No one had come to relieve him. No ships had arrived. And yet, there was someone, or something, waiting in the tower. Elias hesitated at the base of the stairs, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the pull of something ancient in the air, something that had lingered in this place for far longer than he had. It was a feeling he could not explain, a sense of foreboding that gnawed at the edge of his mind, whispering of things best left untouched. But curiosity, or perhaps madness, urged him forward. He climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps muted on the worn stone steps. The tapping became more pronounced, now a distinct series of knocks, as though someone was knocking on a door, trying to get in. Elias reached the top of the tower and paused, his hand gripping the cold iron railing. The door to the lantern room stood slightly ajar, a crack of dim light spilling out from the other side. He took a deep breath, his heart thudding painfully in his chest, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the flickering lantern, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. But it was the figure in the corner that caught his attention. A tall, thin shape, draped in ragged clothing, stood motionless by the edge of the glass, staring out into the thickening fog. Elias's voice faltered in his throat. "Who are you?" The words came out strained, almost a whisper, as though he feared the figure might dissolve if he spoke too loudly. The figure turned slowly, its eyes hollow and empty, the skin pale and drawn tight over the bones of its face. There was something eerie about the way it moved, like it was tethered to the room by invisible strings. It smiled. No, not a smile, but a grimace, twisted and unnatural. "I've been waiting," the figure whispered, its voice thin and raspy, like a breath lost in the wind. Elias's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he was seeing. He took a step back, his hand reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. Waiting for what? Elias managed to ask, his voice barely above a breath. The figure's lips moved again, but the words that came out were garbled, distorted, as though the very air in the room itself was twisting them. "For the light, to return, to guide me, to take me home." Elias blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to keep pace with the growing sense of terror that clawed at him. There was no one else on the island, no one but him. This was impossible. It had to be a trick, a hallucination brought on by the isolation, the madness of being alone for so long. He stepped back toward the door, his legs unsteady beneath him. But as he did, the figure moved toward him, its gaunt form gliding across the room with an unsettling grace. It reached out, its hand cold and pale, and placed it gently on Elias's arm. He froze, a jolt of cold fear shooting through his body. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure's lips parted, and Elias thought he saw something flicker behind its eyes, a brief glimmer of recognition. Or was it pity? "I'm the keeper," it said, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I was lost, but you will guide me." And then, without warning, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the eerie silence of the tower behind. Elias stood there, breathless and shaking, his pulse hammering in his ears. For a long time, he stood frozen in place, the reality of what had just happened settling over him like a heavy fog. His mind struggled to make sense of it all. The keeper, the one who had vanished before him, had not been a ghost. He had been the very thing Elias feared most. A man, lost and broken, driven mad by the isolation, just as he was now. And in that moment, Elias realized with a cold clarity that he was no longer alone. The island had claimed him. The curse of the keeper had found its new victim. The light flickered once more, dimming, and then went out. Chapter 7. When the beacon fails. The storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. The wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse, rattling the shutters and sending gusts of cold air sweeping through the rooms. Elias stood in the center of the keeper's quarters, the weight of the past hours pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. His mind spun with the images of the figure, the thing he had seen in the lantern room. What was it? Was it a ghost? A memory? Or something else entirely, something more terrifying? His hands gripped the edge of the desk as he tried to steady himself, but his heart still raced, his breath shallow and erratic. He could feel the pulse of the island beneath his feet, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to echo in his bones. It was as if the very land itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The lantern, which had gone dark in the tower, was now the only source of light in the room. Elias had attempted to reignite it, but the matches slipped from his fingers as his hands trembled. The flame that had once been a symbol of his safety now seemed to mock him. He was no longer the keeper. He was the one in need of guidance, lost in a place that offered no refuge. A sound broke the silence, a faint tapping, like the one he had heard before, but it was distant, coming from somewhere below. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The same tapping, the same rhythmic knock. The figure in the tower had spoken of light, of being guided, and now, it seemed, there was more to the curse than he could have imagined. He forced himself to move, to do something. The longer he stood still, the more the island seemed to close in around him. Each step he took toward the staircase felt heavier, as if the weight of the place itself was trying to pull him down into its depths. He passed through the hallway, his fingers brushing the walls for support, feeling the cool stone beneath his fingertips. The fog outside pressed in on the windows, as thick and dense as the fear that swirled in his chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from just beyond the door to the tower. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. He was terrified of what he might find, but the same force that had driven him to open the door before now propelled him forward. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. He turned the handle and stepped into the tower room. The air felt colder than before, the temperature dropping with each passing second, until Elias could see his breath in the dim light. The room was empty, or so it seemed. The lantern had gone out completely, leaving only the faintest traces of light from the small window. Elias's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing, except for the shadows. They seemed to be moving, swirling, as if they were alive. Elias's heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. The tapping continued, but now it was coming from the very walls themselves, like 1,000 fingers drumming against the stone. The sound was maddening, unbearable, and then it stopped. Elias stood frozen, his ears ringing with the absence of sound. The quiet stretched on, thick and oppressive, pressing down on him like a vice. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of life, but there was nothing, just the silence, just the shadows. And then, in the far corner, a figure appeared. It was not the same figure he had seen before, but it was close, too close. The shape was indistinct, blurred at the edges, as if it were not quite solid. It stood motionless, staring at him with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him, to see into the very depths of his soul. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped, frozen by the gaze of the thing before him. The shadows seemed to reach out, curling around him, pulling him closer to the figure, to whatever madness it represented. The figure spoke, its voice a whisper that sent chills through his spine. "You are not alone," it said, its words curling around him like a tendril of smoke. "You have always been here. You have always been a part of this place." Elias's mind reeled. What did it mean? How could he be a part of this place? He had only arrived days ago. This was all so wrong, so impossible. And yet, there it was, an undeniable truth hanging in the air like a dark omen. "You will understand soon enough," the figure continued, its voice now a low hum that seemed to resonate with the very walls. "The island calls to you. It has claimed you." The wind outside picked up again, howling through the cracks in the lighthouse. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable, and Elias could feel the weight of it, the suffocating pressure of the island closing in around him. His mind spun, the words of the figure echoing in his ears. "You are the keeper now," it said again, its form flickering, becoming more insubstantial with each passing second. "The island will never let you go." Suddenly, the figure dissolved into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. Elias was left standing in the dark, alone once more. But he was not truly alone. The presence of the island, of the curse, lingered in the room, in the very air around him. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the revelation settled over him. He had thought he was the one in control, the one in charge of the lighthouse, the keeper of the light. But the island had other plans. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed the keeper before him. And now, there was no escaping it. Elias staggered back toward the staircase, his mind spinning, his body trembling. He had to leave. He had to get out of the lighthouse, out of this place. But as he reached the door to the outside world, a sharp realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The island wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was not going to let him go. Chapter 8. Footsteps in the Night. Elias stood at the door of the lighthouse, his hand trembling on the iron handle. He had only opened it a crack, but beyond the threshold, the world outside seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The fog had thickened since his last glance out the window, now pressing against the building with a weight that felt suffocating, like a living, breathing entity determined to hold him captive. The wind was relentless, howling through the cracks and crevices of the lighthouse, a ceaseless, agonizing wail that pierced the silence, mocking his every attempt to escape. With a final, shuddering breath, Elias pushed the door open, stepping into the blinding white. The world beyond the lighthouse was an abyss of swirling fog, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was as though the island had vanished, and all that remained was an ocean of mist, swallowing everything whole. He could no longer see the jagged cliffs or the vast, crashing waves. It was as if the entire world had been erased, leaving him alone in a void. He hesitated. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to return to the relative safety of the lighthouse. But there was something in the fog, something that drew him forward. A faint pull, like a whisper on the wind, urging him to move, to follow. With a reluctant step, he crossed the threshold, the cold dampness of the fog creeping into his bones, soaking his clothes and chilling him to the core. His breath formed in the air, dissipating almost immediately into the thickening mist. He strained his eyes, but the world around him was swallowed whole by the fog. There was no path to follow, no sign of life, just the endless expanse of white. Then, a voice, a whisper carried on the wind, so faint he could scarcely hear it, but unmistakable in its intent. His name.
Elias.
He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was the same voice, the same whisper he had heard in the tower. The figure, the keeper, the presence that had haunted him since his arrival. It was here, in the fog, calling to him. "Elias, come closer." The voice was closer now, clearer, and with it came a shiver of dread that wrapped itself around his spine like a cold, unyielding hand. The fog seemed to shift, as though parting to reveal something just beyond his sight. But he could not see it, could not discern where the voice was coming from. The mist was thick, blurring his vision, making everything indistinct, as if the island itself was trying to obscure the truth. "Come. It's waiting." He should have turned back. He should have returned to the lighthouse, locked the door, and never left. But something in his chest tightened, a compulsion that he could not explain. He had to know what the island wanted from him. He had to understand why he was here, trapped in this nightmare that seemed to spiral deeper with each passing moment. Against his better judgment, Elias took another step forward, his feet sinking into the soft, damp earth beneath him. The air grew colder still, biting at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the voice, by the pull of whatever lay hidden in the fog. He had barely moved a few paces when the ground beneath him gave way, a sudden drop that sent him stumbling forward. He caught himself just in time, his hands scraping against the rough stone of the ground as he regained his balance. His heart pounded in his chest, and panic surged through him. Was it a trap? Was the fog trying to consume him, to drag him into its depths? A low, mocking laugh echoed around him, soft at first, but growing louder. It was not a human laugh. It was too cold, too disembodied. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Fool," the voice said, its tone dripping with disdain. "You cannot escape." Elias's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a presence, suffocating him, pressing down on his chest, forcing him to listen, to obey. The laughter continued, growing darker, more insistent, and the fog seemed to thicken around him, its tendrils creeping toward his feet, curling around his legs like hands trying to pull him deeper into the island's grasp. His head spun. The laughter, the voice, the presence, it was all too much. He had to leave. He had to. "Elias," the voice interrupted, softer now, coaxing. "Come closer. It's almost time. The light must return." Elias's thoughts were scattered, his mind fogged with confusion and fear. The light the figure had spoken of. The lantern. Was it somehow tied to this madness? Was the island calling him to take on the mantle of the keeper, just as the previous one had before him? The fog parted suddenly, and Elias stumbled forward, drawn by an invisible force. Through the thinning mist, he could make out a shape in the distance. A figure. It was a man, standing motionless in the mist, his features obscured by the fog, but his presence undeniable. "You've been chosen," the figure said, its voice calm, even soothing. "The island has claimed you, just as it claimed me." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something in the figure's voice sounded familiar. It was as though he had heard it before, in another time, another place. The fog shifted, the world around him seeming to warp and blur, and suddenly he was back at the lighthouse, standing in front of the door once again. But this time, something was different. The door was ajar, the light flickering faintly from inside. A figure stood in the doorway, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce through him, seeing the very heart of his soul. It was the same figure. "The keeper. Come inside, Elias," the figure said softly. "The island has chosen you." Elias's legs shook as he stepped forward, his mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. Fear, confusion, curiosity. He was no longer sure of what was real and what was the product of his own madness. The fog had returned, swirling around him, thickening, choking the world into nothingness. But the lighthouse loomed before him, a beacon in the distance, drawing him in. The island had claimed him, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Signal. Elias stood at the threshold of the lighthouse, his heart racing with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The figure, the keeper, had vanished, leaving nothing but a lingering chill in the air and the faint echo of its voice. The fog pressed in around him like an unseen hand, urging him forward. He had crossed the line. He had stepped beyond the point of no return. The island had marked him, and now he was tethered to it, bound by forces far beyond his understanding. The door creaked on its hinges as he pushed it open, the sound sharp and hollow in the thick silence. Inside, the lighthouse was as he had left it, but something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with a presence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. His footsteps echoed through the empty space, the sound unnervingly loud against the quiet. The lantern, now dim and sputtering, cast weak light across the room, and the shadows seemed to stretch, curling and twisting as if alive. He took a hesitant step forward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The walls felt closer than before, the ceiling lower, as though the very structure of the lighthouse had shifted in the time he had been away. Elias ran his hand along the wall for support, the rough stone cool to the touch. He could feel the pulse of the island beneath his feet, a slow, rhythmic thrum that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. The island was alive, alive in ways he had never imagined. The voice returned then, a whisper just at the edge of his consciousness. Elias. It was soft, almost tender, but it carried with it an undeniable weight. It's time. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice came from everywhere, from within the very walls, from the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. He could no longer tell if it was the island speaking to him, or if it was something inside of him, something that had been awakened by the curse that now bound him to this place. It's time to take your place, the voice continued. The light must burn again. The keeper must guide. The words were both an invitation and a command, and Elias felt the weight of them settle heavily in his chest. He had been chosen. The island had chosen him, just as it had chosen the keeper before him. But what did it mean to be the keeper? What did it mean to guide the light? He had no answers. Only the suffocating certainty that he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the only way out was through. The lantern flickered once more, casting strange, elongated shadows across the room. Elias moved toward it, his feet unsteady as if the floor itself were shifting beneath him. The flames sputtered weakly, casting a dim glow on the walls, but it was enough. He had to light it again. He had to become the keeper. He had to understand what it meant. His hands trembled as he reached for the lantern. The wick was damp, the oil low, but he was determined. He struck a match, his fingers stiff with fear, and held it to the wick. The flame caught, sputtered, and then steadied, casting light in every direction. The shadows shrank back, and for a moment, the room felt almost normal. But Elias knew better. This was no ordinary room. The island's presence was still here, pressing in on him, suffocating him with its weight. As the lantern burned brighter, Elias felt a shift in the air, a change in the very atmosphere around him. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker, the wind louder, as if the lighthouse itself had come alive with the light. And then, in the midst of the growing chaos, something in the distance caught his eye. A figure. At first, it was barely more than a shadow, indistinct and blurry, moving just beyond the reach of the light. But as Elias stared, the figure solidified, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. It was the keeper, the previous keeper, the one who had been here before him, the one who had succumbed to the madness of the island. The figure stood at the far end of the room, motionless, its back to him. Elias could feel the weight of its presence, the hollow emptiness that seemed to radiate from it like a cold breeze. He tried to call out, but his voice was caught in his throat. The figure remained still, unyielding, as if it was waiting for him to make the first move. "Who are you?" Elias finally managed, his voice shaky and uncertain. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. Instead, it spoke, its voice low and distorted, as if it came from the very walls of the lighthouse. "I was once the keeper, just as you will be. The island, it claims us all, Elias. It claims our minds, our souls, until there is nothing left but the light." Elias stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "But why? Why me?" The figure remained silent, its back still to him, its form blurring at the edges. "You didn't choose this, Elias. The island did. It chooses us all." A sudden gust of wind slammed into the lighthouse, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the room. The fog outside swirled violently, as if responding to the figure's words, and for a brief moment, Elias thought he saw something moving in the mist, a dark shape, too large to be just a figment of his imagination. But when he blinked, it was gone. The figure turned then, its face obscured by the shadow of the hood it wore. "The light must guide," it repeated, its voice growing softer, almost mournful. "It must never fade. It must never go out." Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. The words were heavy, laden with an unbearable truth that he could not yet comprehend. What was this light? What was its purpose? And why did it seem to have such a hold on the island, on the keepers, on him? "The light guides," the figure continued, its voice now a whisper. "But it also consumes." The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in with an invisible force. The shadows stretched long and dark, their edges tinged with something unnatural. The air felt thick, charged with a raw energy that made Elias's skin crawl. Suddenly, the figure lunged at him, its hand reaching out with terrifying speed, grabbing him by the wrist with an iron grip. Elias gasped, struggling to free himself, but the figure's hold was unyielding. "Listen to me," the figure hissed, its voice barely audible over the growing wind. "You must never let the light go out. If it fades, if it dies, the island will take you. It will take your soul, just as it took mine." Elias's mind spun, his vision blurring at the edges. He felt his legs give way beneath him, but the figure's grip held him steady, pulling him closer. "Do you understand, Elias?" the figure whispered. "The island will claim you. You will never leave. You will never escape." And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure released him. Elias stumbled backward, falling to the cold stone floor as the room around him spun. He gasped for air, his heart racing. The light of the lantern flickered and dimmed, the shadows lengthening, swallowing everything in their path. The figure was gone, and Elias was alone once more. Alone with the island, alone with the light. But the curse had already begun. Chapter 10. The Locked Room. Elias woke to the sound of the lighthouse's bell tolling, its deep, mournful clangs reverberating through the still night. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like a heavy, oppressive blanket. It was as if the island had become a living entity, breathing with him, exhaling its secrets into the very air he breathed. The light in the lantern sputtered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of the room. He could still feel the figure's cold touch on his wrist, the urgency in its words reverberating through his mind. "The island will claim you." The voice lingered like a phantom, refusing to leave him. Elias rose unsteadily from the floor, his body aching as though he had been struck, his mind clouded by the horrors he had just witnessed. The lighthouse felt different now, darker, more foreboding. The air was thicker, like the walls themselves were pressing in on him. He couldn't shake the sense that the island was watching, waiting, judging. The keeper's curse had taken root inside him, and no matter how far he tried to run, it would follow him. His hands trembled as he approached the lantern, attempting to steady the flame, but it flickered and flared unnaturally, casting a flash of light that illuminated the room in sharp relief. Shadows swirled, twisting and shifting as if alive, clawing at the walls. Elias stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The sense of being watched was suffocating. He was no longer alone in the lighthouse. In the distance, the bell tolled again. With great effort, Elias forced himself to look away from the lantern's flickering light. He could no longer deny it. Something was terribly wrong with this place. The island, the lighthouse, even the air itself was steeped in an energy he could not begin to understand. It was ancient, pulsing with a power that threatened to consume him, and no matter how much he tried to resist, he knew deep down that he had been marked. He was now part of the island, its history, its curse. There was no escape. His gaze shifted to the door, the only way out of this suffocating space. The cold wind outside howled, pushing at the door with an unrelenting force, as though it, too, was urging him to leave. But Elias knew better. The island wouldn't let him leave. It was a trap. It always had been. He had to confront it. He had to find out what the island wanted from him, why it had chosen him. As he stepped toward the door, the ground beneath him shifted, the floorboards creaking ominously. Elias stopped in his tracks, heart leaping into his throat. For a fleeting moment, the shadows in the room seemed to coalesce, forming shapes, figures, familiar faces, distorted by time and decay. His breath caught in his throat. They were all people who had come before him, trapped in the same fate. The previous keepers, the ones who had failed. He could see their faces, hollowed and tormented, eyes wide with terror, mouths twisted in silent screams. They reached toward him, their hands outstretched, begging for salvation that would never come. The island had taken them all, consumed them until there was nothing left but their souls, trapped in an eternal cycle of madness. Elias stumbled backward, shaking his head as if trying to shake the vision from his mind. But it lingered, like a stain on his soul. The weight of their despair crushed him, pulling him deeper into the curse. He couldn't escape, not physically, not mentally. The island would hold him until there was nothing left of him but a hollow shell, just like the keepers before him. He turned away from the door, unable to face the figures any longer. His eyes fell on the lantern again, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The flames sputtered and popped, threatening to go out, and Elias felt a surge of panic flood his chest. The light was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. Without it, the island would consume him completely. Elias grabbed the lantern, his hands trembling as he poured oil into it, desperate to keep the flame alive. But no matter how much he tried, the lantern refused to burn bright. The wick smoldered, the oil bubbling uselessly, and the light dimmed further. He could feel the shadows closing in, suffocating him, feeding off his fear. The bell tolled again, its sound louder now, vibrating through his very bones. Suddenly, the door to the lighthouse burst open with a deafening crash. Elias whipped around, his heart hammering in his chest. The fog outside had thickened to an almost unnatural density, swirling in the doorway like a living thing. And through the fog, emerging slowly from the mist, was the keeper. The figure stood tall, cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the dark fabric of its hood. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Was it real? Or was this just another trick of the island? The keeper stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it were a part of the fog itself. "You are not the first," it said, its voice low and rasping, as though it had not spoken in centuries. "Nor will you be the last." Elias swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his throat tight. What are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am the keeper," the figure replied, its voice echoing in the chamber. "The one who watches, who guides the light. I was once like you, lost, unaware of the curse. But now I am nothing but a shadow, a part of the island, and soon you will be too." The figure moved closer, its form growing clearer, more defined, yet still shrouded in an air of death. The air grew colder, and Elias shuddered, his breath visible in the freezing space between them. "No," he whispered, stepping backward, his eyes wide with panic. "I won't let it happen." The keeper reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long, and touched Elias's shoulder. His body went rigid, a jolt of ice shooting through his spine. "The island chooses. You cannot resist it. You cannot escape." Elias gasped, pulling away, his mind reeling from the sudden cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. The keeper's touch was like death itself, pulling him closer to the edge of insanity. He could feel his grip on reality beginning to slip, the room spinning as his vision blurred. The fog outside seemed to swirl faster, the bell tolling with an urgency that made his pulse race. "Please," Elias begged, his voice raw with fear. I can't stay here. I can't become one of you." The keeper's face, still hidden in the shadows, tilted slightly. "You will, Elias. You will. Just like the rest of us. We are bound to this place, bound by the light. And when the light fades, we will fade with it." A wave of nausea washed over Elias. The keeper's words were like a poison, sinking deep into his soul. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him, locked in place by the overwhelming force of the keeper's presence. The island's grip was tightening, and Elias could feel himself slipping further into its depths. The figure stepped closer, its voice a low, hollow whisper. "Do you feel it? The call of the island. It's in your blood now. You cannot outrun it. You cannot hide." And in that moment, Elias knew the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. He had been chosen the moment he set foot on this cursed island, and now he would become a part of its twisted history. The keeper's cold hand tightened around his arm, and the last remnants of Elias's will crumbled away. Chapter 11. Through the eye of the fog. The cold that seeped into Elias's bones lingered long after the keeper's touch had left him. His body trembled uncontrollably, but it wasn't just from the icy chill in the air. Something deeper was happening, a creeping sensation of inevitability, like the island itself was drawing him into its depths. It whispered to him through the walls, through the floors, through the very air he breathed. And no matter how hard he tried to shut it out, he could hear it. The light is fading. Time is running out. He stumbled back from the keeper, his heart racing, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. The bell tolled again, its sound deafening, as though the very heart of the island was beating in sync with his own panic. But Elias couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his legs trembling beneath him, his mind a blur of confusion and terror. "Why?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Why me?" The keeper's hollow eyes glinted with an eerie, ancient knowledge as it stepped closer, its form like a shadow cast against the flickering lantern. "You are not the first to ask that question," it replied, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the empty lighthouse. "The island chooses its keepers, those who are weak, lost, broken. It feeds on them. It twists their souls until they become part of it." Elias could feel his throat closing up, the weight of its words sinking deep into him. "I didn't ask for this," he protested, but even as he said it, he knew it was pointless. The island had already claimed him. There was no escaping its grip, no turning back. "None of us asked for it," the keeper said, its voice growing softer, almost sympathetic. "But the island does not care. It takes what it wants. It always has." The fog outside thickened even further, swirling in a suffocating embrace around the lighthouse. Elias's eyes flicked to the lantern once more. The flames sputtered and weakened, as though reflecting his own fading will to resist. The keeper was right. He could feel the island's hunger in his very bones, in the marrow of his soul. It was pulling him toward something, toward a destiny he didn't understand but couldn't avoid. "What happens to me?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. The keeper's gaze seemed to pierce him, its eyes dark pools of nothingness. "You will join us," it said, its words cold and final. "You will become one with the island, bound to its curse. Forever." Elias felt a shudder ripple through him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had always known there was something wrong with the island, something ancient and malevolent lurking beneath its surface. But now, as the keeper spoke, he realized the terrible truth. The island wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a thing that consumed the very souls of those it ensnared, twisting them into shadows that would never find peace. The wind howled louder outside, battering the lighthouse with a force that seemed determined to tear it apart. The bell tolled once more, and Elias's heart seemed to skip a beat. It was louder now, more insistent, like a warning. But what was the warning? That time had run out? That the final hour had arrived? He glanced toward the staircase leading up to the lantern room, the light above flickering faintly. The light. It was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay, the only thing that gave him any semblance of control over this nightmare. But the keeper's words echoed in his mind. The light was fading. It was only a matter of time before the island would claim him completely. "Why do you stay here?" Elias asked, his voice filled with desperation. "Why don't you leave?" The keeper's eyes glinted in the low light, its lips curling into a twisted smile. "I cannot leave," it replied simply. "None of us can. The island. It is our prison, and it is our curse. We are bound to it, as you will be. Forever." A tremor ran through Elias as he looked at the keeper, the weight of its words pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He wanted to scream, to run, but the truth was inescapable. There was no escape. He was already a part of the island, as much a part of it as the keeper. The darkness had claimed him, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by a series of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. Elias's head snapped up, his heart racing. It was coming from the lantern room. A chill shot through him as he realized what it was. Someone, or something, was up there. Something was making its way toward him, and the footsteps grew louder with every passing second. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice shaky with fear. The keeper tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. "You should not have called to them," it murmured. "You will not be able to escape once they arrive." The footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. Elias's pulse quickened as he turned toward the staircase, unable to tear his gaze away from the shadows that were moving with unnatural speed and precision. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Then, from the darkness above, a figure emerged. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he saw the silhouette of a man standing at the top of the stairs, his face hidden in shadow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in the tattered remnants of a long coat. His movements were jerky, unnaturally stiff, as if he were struggling to control his own body. It wasn't the keeper. It was someone else. Someone who had been here before. Someone who had been consumed by the island. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to descend the staircase, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. He could feel the temperature drop further, the air growing colder with each step the figure took. "No," Elias breathed. "Please don't." The figure's head snapped up, revealing a face that was pale, gaunt, and hollow. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, void of any recognition of any life. The man was nothing more than a shell, a puppet controlled by the island's will. Elias stumbled back, his hand outstretched as if to ward off the figure. But it kept coming, its steps slow, deliberate, unyielding. The keeper's laughter echoed in his ears as the island's grip tightened around him. "You are one of us now," the keeper whispered. its voice a hollow mockery of his own fear. There is no turning back. Elias's heart raced as he backed into the wall, unable to escape. The figure was almost upon him now, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and cold. Elias could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating him, taking him deeper into the island's grasp. And then, in the instant before the figure's hand touched him, Elias understood. There was no escape. There never had been. And now, like all the others before him, he would become a part of the island's curse. Forever. Chapter 12. The Keeper's Curse. Elias awoke with a jolt, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. His heart raced in his chest as though trying to escape, and his limbs trembled from a sensation he couldn't quite name. His surroundings were unfamiliar yet eerily familiar, the walls of the lighthouse closing in around him like a prison. He wasn't sure what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the figure, the gaunt, hollow-eyed man descending the stairs, reaching for him with icy fingers. But now, there was only the silence of the lighthouse, the deep, resonant thrum of the wind battering the outer walls, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. A rush of cold air swept through the room, and Elias sat up abruptly. His eyes flicked to the lantern above him, its flame flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the floor. The dim light seemed to grow weaker with each passing second, and the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the walls were bending to the will of something far greater than he could understand. Elias's mind spun. He tried to recall the details of the moment before his blackout, but the images were fragmented, like broken shards of a shattered mirror. He had been reaching for the figure, trying to push it away, but it had felt too real, too solid for him to escape. The island had taken him, that much was clear. But was he dead? Or was this some kind of twisted dream? A limbo where he was neither truly alive nor fully gone. The whispers returned, slithering through the air like the very fog that clung to the island. The light is fading. The island is hungry. You belong to it now. Elias recoiled, clutching his head as if to block out the voices, but they were relentless, echoing off the stone walls of the lighthouse. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious, but the island seemed to be closing in around him, suffocating him in its grip. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, and staggered toward the stairs leading to the lantern room. The very air seemed to grow denser, thicker, as though the atmosphere itself was conspiring to keep him trapped. He could feel the weight of it on his chest, the sense that something was drawing him closer to the precipice, closer to a fate he couldn't escape. As he ascended the staircase, he felt the temperature drop, the chill creeping up his spine with each step. The wind howled louder, its eerie wail rising in intensity as though to warn him. The walls around him seemed to shift, their very structure warping with each breath he took. When he reached the top, Elias's eyes fell upon the lantern. The flame was almost extinguished now, its flicker barely perceptible. The room was steeped in a haunting stillness, the very air suffused with an unsettling calm that made his skin crawl. The keeper was nowhere to be seen, nor was the figure that had descended the staircase. It was as though they had never been there at all. But Elias knew better. The island was never empty. It was never still. There was always something waiting, lurking in the shadows, watching. A soft creak echoed through the room, and Elias turned toward the sound, his heart leaping into his throat. The lantern flickered, and for a split second, he saw a shadow moving in the corner of his vision. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, them, closer now, an unseen presence that seemed to wrap around him, tightening its grip like an invisible noose. But he couldn't see them. They were there, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception, as though the island itself had taken form in the space between reality and madness. The keeper's words echoed in his mind once more. You will join us. You will become part of the island. Forever. A cold dread washed over him, but he couldn't move. He was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the flickering lantern. The shadows in the room deepened, spreading like ink across water, curling and twisting until they formed shapes. Distorted, unnatural forms that lurked just outside the reach of the light. Then, the whispers grew louder. You cannot escape. The words wrapped around his mind like a vice, tightening with each passing second. Elias's pulse quickened as the shadows grew bolder, inching closer, creeping toward him with an inexorable hunger. He could feel them pressing in, the weight of their presence suffocating him, filling the room with an oppressive force. But then, something changed. The lantern flame sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, Elias was left in total blackness, the silence absolute. He couldn't even hear the wind anymore. The only sound was the pounding of his own heartbeat, each beat like a drum, urging him to act. But what could he do? He was trapped, his every move seemingly anticipated by the island that held him in its grasp. The shadows stirred once more, this time closer than before. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he felt something cold brush against his skin. He jerked back, but there was nowhere to go. And then, from the depths of the darkness, a voice emerged, low, rasping, filled with ancient malice. You are ours now. The voice was familiar, but Elias couldn't place it. He strained to see through the blackness, his eyes desperately searching for anything that could give him some sense of clarity. But there was nothing. No light. No escape. The whispers swelled, crescendoing into a roar of sound that drowned out everything else. Elias's hands shook uncontrollably as the air around him thickened, the pressure mounting, pushing him down, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his lungs burning with each desperate breath he drew. The shadows closed in around him, and he felt himself being pulled into them, dragged by an unseen force that gnawed at his soul. In the depths of his mind, Elias realized the truth. The island wasn't just consuming him. It was consuming his very essence, his memories, his identity. It was taking him apart piece by piece, breaking him down until there was nothing left but an echo of what he had once been. But even as the darkness closed in, even as the island claimed him fully, something within Elias fought back. A tiny flicker of defiance burned in his chest, a flicker of light that refused to be extinguished. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Elias reached out, his hand trembling as he grasped for something, anything. He didn't know what he was reaching for, but he knew he had to try. And then, in the blackness, he felt it. A pulse, a surge of warmth. The island was not finished with him yet. Chapter 13. Beneath the Spiral Stairs. Elias awoke with a sharp, jagged breath that tore through his chest. His lungs burned, as if he had been drowning, and he gasped for air as his surroundings began to slowly materialize around him. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced now by the faint glow of the morning light filtering through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of salt and mildew, and the lighthouse stood as silent and foreboding as ever. But something had shifted. The island felt different now, heavier, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias pushed himself up from the cold floor, his muscles stiff and aching from his prolonged exposure to the island's twisted grasp. His head spun, but he steadied himself against the railing of the stairs, trying to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts. He couldn't remember how he had ended up on the floor, or how long he had been there. Had it been hours? Days? Time had begun to blur into an incomprehensible haze. The disjointed images in his mind, the whispers, the shadowy figures, told him only one thing. Something dark and malevolent still lingered, and it would not let him go. The lantern room above seemed to beckon him, an eerie pull that he couldn't ignore. It felt as though the light itself, the very flame that had flickered weakly in the dark, was now alive with purpose, guiding him, or perhaps trapping him in a web he could not escape. With reluctant steps, Elias began his ascent, each footfall echoing in the hollow space. The walls seemed to press in tighter, their stone surfaces cold and unyielding, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. He reached the top of the staircase and paused. The door to the lantern room was ajar, creaking gently with the wind, as if inviting him to step through. He pushed it open, the wood groaning under his weight, and stepped into the room. The first thing he noticed was the silence, utterly still, save for the whistling of the wind outside, which rattled the old panes of glass. The lantern itself was intact, though its flame was low, casting weak shadows across the room. And there, in the far corner, a figure stood. Elias froze. The man was tall, his back to him, but Elias could feel the weight of his presence as if it filled the entire room. He could not see his face, for the figure stood in shadow, but his posture was rigid, as though he were waiting, standing guard over something unknown. Elias opened his mouth, but his voice faltered, swallowed by the unnatural stillness of the room. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both unfamiliar and hauntingly familiar. It was the keeper. The man's hollow eyes met Elias's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The keeper's face was gaunt, his skin pale, his features drawn tight with an expression of profound sorrow. Yet his eyes were full of something darker, something old and ancient, like a storm cloud waiting to break. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Who are you?" His voice was shaky, but he pressed on. "What is this place?" The keeper did not speak at first, but the silence between them was thick with meaning, the air heavy with secrets that seemed to seep from the very walls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the keeper's lips parted, his voice low and raspy, as though it had not been used in years. "You should not have come," he said, his words laced with a sorrow that echoed deep within Elias's chest. "You should not have come to this cursed place." Elias took a step forward, his heart pounding in his ears. "Cursed? What do you mean? What happened to you?" The keeper's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering to the lantern as if to confirm something. "This island, it is not just a place. It is a prison, and I am its warden." Elias's confusion deepened. A prison? For what? The keeper took a deep breath, his eyes darkening with the weight of his words. "For the souls of those who have died here, for those who are lost, who are forgotten, who never leave." A chill ran down Elias's spine. He had suspected something was wrong with the island, but this was far beyond anything he had imagined. "What do you mean, lost?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? Why are you still here?" The keeper stepped closer, and Elias instinctively took a step back. The man's eyes seemed to pierce into him, searching him with an intensity that was almost unbearable. "I was once like you," the keeper said, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and madness. "I was assigned to this lighthouse, to watch over it, to protect it. But there are forces at work here that no man can understand. The island calls to you. It draws you in. It consumes you. You cannot leave once it has chosen you." Elias's mind reeled. The keeper's words hit him with a brutal force, and he struggled to process them, to make sense of the madness he was hearing. "How long have you been here?" Elias asked, his voice almost hoarse. The keeper's gaze turned inward, his eyes clouded with memories that he seemed unable to escape. I do not know. Time loses its meaning here. Days blend together, and the fog never lifts. You think you can escape, but you cannot. The island will not let you. Elias stepped back, his heart racing. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But the keeper's words were like chains, anchoring him in place. The island is hungry, the keeper whispered, his voice low and urgent. It feeds on the souls of the lost. It feeds on you. And when it is finished, there will be nothing left. You will be one with it. Forever. Elias's legs trembled beneath him, and for a moment, he felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The truth that the keeper spoke was so horrifying, so incomprehensible, that it left him breathless. The island was not just a place, it was alive, and it had claimed the keeper as its prisoner, just as it had claimed the others before him. And now it wanted Elias. Why don't you leave? Elias demanded, his voice rising. Why are you still here? The keeper's gaze softened, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I cannot. I am bound to this place. The island will not let me go. And now it has you. I'm sorry. Elias stepped back again, his heart hammering. The keeper's words were like a death sentence, and for the first time since arriving at the lighthouse, Elias realized the full extent of the danger he was in. He was not just fighting to survive. He was fighting to preserve his very soul. But the keeper's eyes lingered on him, and in that moment, Elias understood. He was not alone on this island. The spirits of the lost were with him, and the keeper had once been one of them. He had made the same mistake Elias had made. He had thought he could escape, but no one left the island. No one. And now, Elias understood that the island had marked him as its next victim. The keeper's final words echoed in his mind as he turned to flee, his pulse racing in his veins. You cannot escape. Chapter 14. The Phantom's Lament. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled away from the keeper, his body moving on instinct rather than thought. His legs felt like lead, weighed down by the gravity of the keeper's words, by the horrific revelation that he was trapped on an island of the lost. The island had already claimed so many, and now it had set its sights on him. Panic surged through him as the cold, salty wind whipped through the cracks in the lantern room, but it was no relief. It only deepened the sense of suffocation that had begun to take hold of his chest. His heart pounded furiously in his ears, and as he stumbled down the narrow staircase, he felt the walls closing in around him. The island had a way of playing tricks on the mind, of distorting reality until it was impossible to tell where the dream ended and the nightmare began. Was he still dreaming? Was the keeper even real? Elias's mind reeled as he pressed his hand to the cold stone wall, trying to steady himself. The island had always been silent, but now, in the wake of the keeper's words, the silence was deafening. It was as though the very air around him held its breath, waiting, watching. The light in the lantern room had flickered and gone out, but the darkness around him felt more oppressive than any mere absence of light. He hurried down the staircase, his legs shaking beneath him, but it was only when he reached the bottom that he heard it. The faintest whisper, carried on the wind. A voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was a soft murmur, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Leave now. Leave while you still can. Elias froze. His pulse quickened. It was not the keeper's voice, nor was it the voice of anyone he knew. It was the voice of the island itself, low, insistent, as though the very ground beneath his feet was calling to him, beckoning him to listen, to understand. He shook his head, desperate to dispel the creeping dread that clawed at his mind. He had to leave. He had to escape the island before it consumed him as it had consumed the keeper. But the path was not clear. Each step he took felt heavier, as though something was pulling him back, as though the island were dragging him deeper into its grasp. His instinct screamed at him to find the boat and flee. There was a small, weathered vessel near the base of the cliffs, the one he had used to cross the short distance from the mainland. If he could get to it, maybe, just maybe, he could escape this cursed place. But as he approached the front door of the lighthouse, the world seemed to warp before him. The wind howled with unnatural intensity, and the fog, which had never been more than a distant haze, began to roll in thick and fast. It enveloped the island, swallowing the lighthouse, the shore, everything. He hesitated at the door. The thick fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and he knew that once he stepped outside, there would be no turning back. He was no longer certain where he was, whether he had already crossed into the island's madness, or if he was still standing in the realm of the living. The whispering voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come closer. Don't turn back. You belong here." The words slithered into his mind like a poison, and he felt the ground beneath him shift. It was as if the island was alive, breathing, shifting in ways he couldn't understand. His gaze swept across the room, and his eyes fell upon the faded, yellowing maps pinned to the walls. They were maps of the island, but they were different, distorted, with strange markings and symbols drawn across them. The keeper's words echoed in his mind again. "I was once like you, assigned to this lighthouse, but the island calls to you. It draws you in. It consumes you." The fog swirled outside, and Elias's mind raced. The keeper had been a victim, just like all the others. The island was a place of torment and despair, but it was also a place of power. It fed on souls, on the lost, on the lonely, and now it was feeding on him. He was not sure how much time had passed before he finally made his decision. His body felt as though it had grown heavier with each passing moment, the fog pressing in on him, smothering his thoughts. He could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the instinct that told him to run, to flee, to escape before it was too late. Elias grabbed the lantern from its hook near the door, desperate to have some source of light as he ventured into the suffocating fog. He needed to see, to find his way, even if it was a dim light in the midst of encroaching darkness. As the lantern flickered weakly to life, he stepped outside. The air was thick and heavy, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. The island felt more oppressive than ever, as though it was closing in, its presence pressing down on him. The stone walls of the lighthouse towered behind him, silent and foreboding, but they offered no comfort now. Elias had no clear path before him, just the dense fog that seemed to stretch endlessly. The small boat was somewhere in the distance, beyond the rocks, but the fog made it impossible to see. Every step he took felt as though he was walking deeper into the unknown, his surroundings constantly shifting, the horizon blurred by the thick mist. The whispering voice continued, but it was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, calling to him from all directions, weaving through the fog like a thread. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." His heart raced in his chest, each beat a reminder of the danger that lurked in the island's depths. He clutched the lantern tighter, its fragile light the only thing keeping him grounded in reality. But with each step, the island seemed to pull at him, its grip tightening, like invisible hands tugging at his soul. The whispers rose, becoming a cacophony in his ears, urging him to stop, to surrender, to accept the fate that had already been sealed for him. Elias's legs began to shake, his breath ragged as he fought to maintain his focus. He had to get to the boat. He had to escape. Then, as if to seal his doom, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. A low rumble echoed through the island, and for a moment, Elias thought the earth itself was coming apart. The lighthouse groaned in the distance, and the fog seemed to pulse, undulating with a dark energy. Elias stopped, his heart in his throat. The fog shifted, and for just a moment, The outline of something large and looming appeared before him. Something tall and twisted, like the shadow of a man. But as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared into the mist, leaving only the oppressive silence. Elias took another step forward, and then another. Chapter 15. The Hidden Passage. The fog thickened as Elias stumbled further into the island's grip, each breath more labored than the last. The lantern in his hand flickered with an unnatural light, its weak flame casting eerie shadows across the twisted landscape. The path ahead was no clearer than it had been when he first stepped outside. In fact, the fog seemed to shift and move in response to his every step, swallowing any sense of direction. The island's pulse, a slow, deliberate thrum, echoed beneath his feet as if the earth itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something. Elias's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but each one collided and crumbled into nothingness, overwhelmed by the incessant whispers that filled the air around him. At first, they had been soft, distant, like a voice from the far reaches of the island. But now, they were louder, insistent, pressing against his mind like 1,000 hands clawing for his thoughts. "Leave this place. You can't stay. The keeper has made his choice, and so must you." The words shifted in and out of his consciousness, a maddening chorus. Elias clenched his teeth, forcing his legs to move forward despite the weight pressing down on him. He had to reach the boat. He had to escape before the island consumed him as it had the keeper. The path seemed endless. The fog, thick and choking, obscured everything beyond the light of the lantern. But even in the obscurity, Elias could feel the subtle shift in the air. The way the island seemed to breathe in tandem with him, its pulse quickening as he moved deeper. The whispers swirled in his mind, now louder, now more frantic. "You can't outrun it. The island has already claimed you. You belong here." He shook his head, trying to force the thoughts from his mind, but the fog only seemed to grow thicker with each step. He could barely see his hands in front of him, the light from the lantern casting strange, distorted shadows that danced like twisted silhouettes. And then, in the midst of it, he saw something, a shape moving in the fog ahead. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the weight of the island's presence. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. An indistinct shadow, a tall, hunched figure, standing motionless in the mist. Elias froze. The air around him seemed to tighten, the silence now heavier than ever. The figure didn't move, but Elias felt the unmistakable presence of something, someone, watching him from the darkness. The whispering in his mind intensified, now a relentless barrage of sound, as if the very walls of the fog were speaking directly to him. "The keeper has been waiting for you. The island has always been waiting for you." His heart skipped a beat. The keeper. Elias's feet began to move, albeit reluctantly. Each step felt like a betrayal to his instincts, which screamed at him to turn back, to run, to escape before it was too late. But there was something about the figure ahead, something that beckoned him, called to him like an invisible force. The closer he got, the more real it became. The silhouette of a man, still as a statue, standing in the fog. As Elias reached the figure, the mist seemed to part slightly, revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign. It was a man, older, his features gaunt and hollowed out by years of isolation. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling thing about him. Pale, glassy, and vacant, as if they had seen things that no man should ever see. The man's mouth twitched into a faint, unsettling smile. "You've come at last." The voice was dry, raspy, like the cracking of old wood. Elias's blood ran cold. He knew this man. "You." Elias's voice caught in his throat. He stepped back, eyes widening in disbelief. "You're the keeper?" The man's smile deepened, though it was more of a grimace than anything resembling warmth. He did not answer directly, but instead, his gaze drifted over Elias's face, studying him with an unnerving intensity. "The island calls to you," the keeper murmured, his voice carrying an odd cadence. "It has chosen you, just as it chose me. And now you will understand." Elias took another step back, his body trembling. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his chest tightening with each breath. The keeper's words, the way they hung in the air, felt like a heavy chain around his neck, threatening to drag him under. "I don't understand," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why? Why me?" The keeper's eyes darkened, and his smile turned into something darker, more sinister. "The island sees those who are lost," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It draws them in, pulls them down. It is a place of endings and new beginnings. There is no escaping it. Not for me, not for you." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The fog, the island, the keeper, everything was closing in on him. The whispers surged once more, growing louder until they became a chorus, echoing off the cliffs, reverberating through the air around him. "You cannot escape it. There is no escape from the island." The words raked at Elias's mind, digging into him, finding the deepest parts of his fear, of his doubt. He had come to this island looking for answers, seeking a way to make sense of the darkness that had haunted him for so long. But now, the island was offering him nothing but madness. "No," Elias gasped, shaking his head, as if he could physically reject the keeper's words. "I will leave. I will get on that boat, and I'll never come back." The keeper's hollow laugh filled the air, a sound that sent shivers racing through Elias's veins. "You're already here, Elias. The island has already claimed you. You will not leave. Not now. Not ever." Elias's heart raced in his chest. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing, and the keeper's presence seemed to grow more imposing with each passing second. "You're lying," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real." But the keeper's eyes bore into him, empty and unblinking. "It is real. This is real. The island is all that is left. And soon, you will see what I see. You will understand." Elias took a step back, his mind reeling. His vision blurred as panic surged in his chest. The island, the keeper, everything was becoming too much, too real. The weight of the fog, the whispers, the madness pressing in on him. It was suffocating. He turned, desperate to escape, to flee from the island's grip, but the fog was everywhere now. It wasn't just around him. It was in him, consuming him. The land beneath him shifted, the ground trembling, and as he looked around, Elias saw it, a dark shape rising from the fog, moving like a shadow across the island. It was coming for him. The island was no longer just a place. It was his destiny. Chapter 16. The face at the window. Elias's legs faltered beneath him, his heart pounding in his chest as he stumbled backward, the weight of the fog pressing against him, suffocating him with its unnatural thickness. The shape that had risen from the depths of the mist loomed before him, an indistinct shadow that moved with purpose, its outline shifting like something far too fluid to be real. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind teetering on the brink of collapse as the island itself seemed to close in on him. The keeper's voice, now distant, still echoed in his ears. "The island has claimed you, Elias. You cannot escape." Panic surged within him, choking the breath from his lungs. He had been wrong. He had thought he could outrun the island, that he could leave the madness behind. But the fog, the whispers, the haunting presence of the keeper, it was all part of something far greater, far darker. than he had ever imagined. There was no escaping it. Not now. The figure in front of him took another step, its form no longer shifting but growing clearer. It was tall, thin, with long, gnarled arms that seemed to stretch and bend in impossible ways. Its face was hollow, its eyes dark, like empty voids, yet they burned into Elias with a malevolent force, pulling at his very soul. The shape took another step, its shadow casting a long, terrifying stretch across the fog-covered ground. Elias's legs finally gave way, and he collapsed to his knees. The ground beneath him felt like it was shifting, undulating, as if the earth itself was alive and breathing, holding him in place. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that surrounded him, calling to him, taunting him, promising him the fate he had tried to avoid. "You are one of us now? The Keeper's curse has claimed you." Elias's head spun, the world tilting as he reached for the ground beneath him, his fingers sinking into the damp earth. He could feel the weight of the island pressing against him, dragging him into its depths, its unseen embrace suffocating him. The figure moved closer, its presence now overwhelming. The air around Elias seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping with each breath he took. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, his body shaking in the unnatural chill that had settled in the fog. And then, the shape stopped in front of him. Elias could feel its cold, hollow gaze on him, the weight of those empty eyes pressing down on his soul. His throat tightened, but he couldn't force the words out. There was nothing left to say. His mind was numb, his thoughts scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror, too fragmented to make sense of. The shape tilted its head, a grotesque mockery of curiosity, before it reached down with long, skeletal fingers and touched his shoulder. The moment the cold skin made contact, a shock of ice surged through Elias, coursing through his veins like a violent river, freezing his very essence. His body locked in place, unable to move, unable to cry out. All he could do was stare into the darkness of the creature's eyes, feeling himself slowly slipping away. "This is how it ends," the voice of the island whispered, soft and final, in his mind. But then, through the haze of his panic and fear, something else flickered to life inside him. A memory, a fleeting image. He saw it, the lighthouse, its light sweeping across the sea, steady and unyielding against the encroaching darkness. His hand, gripping the lantern's handle, the flickering flame dancing in the night. And then, the words came to him, faint at first, like a whisper against the howling wind. "The Keeper was not always this way. He was once like you, like me. We have all been touched by the island's curse, but we can fight it. We can fight it if we remember who we are." The figure's hand tightened on his shoulder, its grip like iron. Yet Elias's mind had shifted. The island's hold on him loosened, if only just for a moment. He could feel the flicker of something, hope, or perhaps defiance, burning within him. He forced his hand upward, reaching for the lantern that had been lying at his side. His fingers brushed the cool metal, trembling, but he clung to it, drawing strength from the small flame still flickering within. The fog seemed to recede, just a little, as if recognizing the spark of resistance within him. The coldness in his chest eased slightly, and his breath came easier. The creature in front of him, no, the Keeper, stared at him, its hollow eyes filled with something unreadable. For a moment, the air around them stilled, as if the island itself had paused to watch. Then, the Keeper spoke, his voice soft and regretful, yet filled with a sorrow Elias could feel deep in his bones. "You cannot fight what is inevitable, Elias. We are all bound by the curse. The island claims us all in the end. It is the only way." Elias swallowed, feeling the weight of the words pressing down on him like 1,000 stones. The Keeper was right in one thing. The island did claim everyone in the end, but that didn't mean he had to surrender to it. That didn't mean he had to give in. No, Elias thought, feeling the spark within him grow, the flame of defiance flickering more brightly. I don't have to give in. With a surge of strength he didn't know he had, Elias wrenched himself away from the keeper's grip. His hand, still clutching the lantern, pressed forward, the small flame now blazing with renewed intensity. The fog around him recoiled, the whispers faltering, as if the island itself was momentarily unsure of how to react. The keeper staggered back, his dark eyes wide with something close to fear. The island, the force that had claimed so many before Elias, seemed to recoil for the first time, retreating from the light. You cannot escape it. You cannot win, the keeper said, but there was a tremor in his voice now, as if even he felt the shift in the air. Elias took a step forward, his voice firm, his heart steady. I will not become you, he said. I won't let the island control me. I will fight until the end. The fog parted before him, the path ahead now slightly clearer. The keeper, for all his malevolent power, was silent, as if unsure how to respond. Elias didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walking steadily through the fog, the lantern held high, its light pushing back the darkness, revealing a way forward. There was no turning back. The island would not give up without a fight, but neither would he. For the first time since he had set foot on this cursed land, Elias felt something resembling hope, faint, fragile, but real, and it was enough to keep him moving forward. The island may have claimed others, but it would not claim him. Chapter 17. The Survivor's Secret. Elias's footsteps echoed in the dense fog, a rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with the beating of his heart. The lantern's light flickered as it cut through the thick, oppressive mist, its flame steady but growing dimmer with each step he took. The island, once full of ominous presence, now felt like a distant memory, though the weight of its curse still hung heavily on him. He had defied the keeper, or so he thought, but the island had a way of deceiving those who believed they had won. The fog stretched endlessly around him, creating a labyrinth that seemed to shift and change with every movement. His mind was a haze, and his body, fatigued from days of sleepless wandering, felt as though it was no longer his own. Yet his resolve remained unbroken. He could not, would not, allow the island to claim him as it had so many before. As he walked, the whispers began again, creeping into his thoughts, soft at first, like a barely audible murmur in the wind. The keeper's curse cannot be undone, Elias. The words swirled around him, coming from no one and everyone at once, as though the island itself was speaking through the very air. You cannot escape what has already been set in motion. Elias ignored the voice, focusing instead on the lantern. It had become his beacon, his lifeline to reality, and he wasn't about to let the island take it from him. The light flickered again, sputtering for a moment before steadying. His hand, shaking with exhaustion, gripped the handle tighter. He wasn't done. Not yet. Ahead, the mist parted briefly, revealing a faint outline of the lighthouse. The structure stood tall and imposing, its silhouette barely visible through the fog that clung to its walls like a shroud. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The lighthouse had been his goal all along, the place where the keeper's madness had begun and where it would end. But as he drew closer, a strange unease began to settle over him. The lighthouse, which had once been a symbol of hope, now appeared more like a monument to despair. The door, which had once been closed, was ajar, as though inviting him in. The light within seemed distant, flickering weakly as if struggling to stay alive. Elias hesitated, his feet faltering for a moment before he pushed forward. The door creaked as he stepped inside, the sound of it grinding against the stone floor sending a chill down his spine. The interior of the lighthouse was as cold and silent as the island itself. The walls, once adorned with memories of those who had tended to the light, were now stripped bare, save for the faded marks left behind by time. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the wind howled outside, rattling the glass windows like the cries of 1,000 lost souls. Elias's breath caught as he saw it, the keeper. The figure stood at the base of the spiral staircase, its form cast in shadow by the weak light that came from the lantern above. The keeper's gaunt face was turned toward him, his hollow eyes gleaming with a predatory light. He had waited for Elias, his presence here no coincidence. "You've come," the keeper's voice echoed, low and cold, like the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. "You thought you could escape, but the island has other plans. You've been marked. There is no way out." Elias's pulse quickened, his mind racing. The keeper's words were heavy with truth, yet Elias refused to let fear take root. He had already faced the island's grip, had already stood in the face of its darkness. "I'm not like you," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I won't be claimed. Not by you, not by this island." The keeper's lips curled into a smile that was more a grimace than anything resembling warmth. "You misunderstand, Elias. The island doesn't claim anyone. It simply reveals who they truly are. You can't escape it. The curse will always find its way in the end." Elias's hand tightened around the lantern, the flame now flickering erratically, as if it, too, was caught in a battle against the island's pull. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the keeper's, refusing to show weakness. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Elias said, his words carrying an authority that surprised even him. "I've seen what you've become, and I won't follow in your footsteps." The keeper's smile faded, replaced by a look of dark amusement. "You think you can defy me? I was once like you, too, full of hope, full of purpose. But in the end, the island consumes us all. It has consumed me. It will consume you." Elias took another step, and the keeper's words faltered, his gaze flickering toward the lantern. The faint light seemed to push back the darkness, illuminating the keeper's twisted features, revealing the madness that had consumed him long ago. "I'm not like you," Elias repeated, more to himself than to the keeper. "I won't be." The keeper tilted his head, the shadows of the room shifting in response to his movements. "You believe that? You believe you can outlast the island's curse? It's already inside you, Elias. It's already been seeded, and it will grow, just as it did in me." Elias's heart pounded, but he refused to let doubt seep in. The keeper was right about one thing. There was something inside him. The island had marked him, had branded him with its darkness. But Elias had something else now, a fire that burned brighter than any curse the island could impose. "I'll find a way to end this," he said, the words ringing with certainty. "I'll end it or I'll die trying." The keeper's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of uncertainty in the ancient figure. The keeper's face twisted with rage, his form trembling as if the island itself were beginning to fight against the resistance in Elias's words. The fog seemed to close in again, swirling around them in a chaotic dance, as if the very air was torn between the two forces. Elias stepped back, his mind racing for the next move. He had no plan, no weapon, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stay here, couldn't remain in the lighthouse any longer. The curse would not be defeated through strength alone. He had to confront the heart of it. With a final glance at the keeper, who was now seething with unspoken fury, Elias turned and sprinted toward the stairs. The lantern's light trembled in his hand as he ascended, each step bringing him closer to the source of the island's power, the light at the top of the lighthouse. There, he hoped, he would find the key to ending the curse. Chapter 18. The light goes out. Elias's breath came in sharp gasps as he ascended the narrow spiral staircase, the dim flicker of the lantern casting unsettling shadows against the cold, stone walls. The keeper's words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the darkness like a curse that had taken root deep in his chest. "You cannot escape it." The thought gnawed at him, threatening to erode the fragile resolve that had kept him moving forward. But Elias refused to listen to the voice of defeat. He had come this far, had faced the island's madness and its relentless grip, and he would not let it claim him now. As he reached the top of the staircase, he hesitated at the threshold of the final chamber, the lantern room, where the great light of the lighthouse once guided ships safely through the stormy seas. But now, as he stepped inside, it was anything but a beacon of hope. The room was empty, save for the massive lens at the center, its thick glass panes clouded with age and neglect. The light that had once shone brightly now flickered weakly, as though struggling against some unseen force, barely managing to push back the heavy fog that encased the island. The air in the room was thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that Elias couldn't explain. It felt as though the very walls were alive, pulsating with the island's malignant presence. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, filling the room with an eerie sound that sent a chill creeping down his spine. He raised the lantern, its flame now small and flickering, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Elias stepped closer to the lens, his hand trembling as he reached out toward it. The glass was cold to the touch, its surface slick with condensation. As he ran his fingers across it, he felt a sudden pulse of energy, as though the lighthouse itself was reacting to his presence. The fog outside seemed to thicken, swirling in chaotic patterns as though drawn to the light within the room. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it was all Elias could hear. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the dim light, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread flood over him. It was as if he were standing at the threshold of something far greater than the keeper, something older and more powerful, something that had existed long before the keeper had ever set foot on the island. And then he heard it, a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat as the voice called out his name, an all-too-familiar sound that sent a wave of panic through him. "Elias!" He spun around, searching the room, but it was empty. The voice had come from nowhere. It was a voice he knew well, one that haunted him, a whisper that had followed him since the moment he had stepped onto the island. "Elena!" His pulse quickened. The voice of the woman he had once loved, the woman whose memory had driven him to this very place, now seemed to echo in the walls of the lighthouse. He had thought her lost to him, her memory buried under the weight of the island's curse. But now, as the voice lingered in the air, he realized something deeper. The island had not just marked him. It had been calling him all along, pulling him closer to its heart. "Elias!" The voice whispered again, this time more insistent, more desperate. He turned back to the light, his mind racing. The island had taken so much from him already. First, it had stolen his peace, his safety, and now it seemed determined to take the one thing he had left, his memories. His connection to Elena, the woman who had once been his anchor, was fading, slipping away as the curse began to consume him. He clenched his fists, frustration and despair rising within him. But then, through the fog of his thoughts, one clear truth emerged. He had to stop it. He had to break the cycle, destroy whatever force had a hold over this place, and free himself and the island, once and for all. Elias approached the lens again, his determination hardening. He knew what he had to do. The light itself had become an anchor for the curse, its power feeding off the very essence of the island's darkness. If he could destroy the light, he could sever the bond that held the island in its grip. With a steady breath, He raised the lantern above his head, preparing to throw it into the heart of the lens, to shatter the glass and let the light fade forever. But before he could act, the door behind him slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. Elias spun around, his heart racing. The hum grew louder, more intense, and suddenly the room was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The fog outside had thickened to the point that it seemed to spill into the lighthouse itself, creeping under the door and swirling around the base of the lens. And then, standing before him, was the keeper. His face was twisted with madness, his eyes wide with an unspoken fury that seemed to fill the room. The keeper's hands were outstretched, his long, bony fingers curling toward Elias like a specter of death. "No!" Elias shouted, his voice breaking through the rising noise. "You won't stop me. I'm ending this." The keeper's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think you can defeat me? You think you can break the curse? It's already in you, Elias. It's always been in you." The fog seemed to thicken around them, the air growing colder, heavier with each passing second. Elias's hand tightened around the lantern, the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He had come this far, and he would not be stopped now. With a final, defiant cry, Elias hurled the lantern toward the lens. Time seemed to slow as the flame streaked through the air, its light a last flicker of resistance against the darkness that had claimed the island. The lantern crashed against the glass, and for a moment, everything went silent. The light inside the lighthouse flickered once, twice, and then went out. For a moment, Elias stood in the darkness, his heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. The fog had receded, and the air felt different. The oppressive weight that had hung over him for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly. He was still standing, still breathing, but the island's grip had loosened. The keeper was gone, but as Elias took a step back, he realized the truth. The curse had not been broken. The island had simply been waiting for the moment when it would claim its final victory. And with that, the lighthouse doors opened, revealing the storm outside, the wind howling as it carried away the last remnants of the curse. Elias stepped into the light, his journey not yet over, but the first glimmer of freedom within his reach. The keeper's curse had not been destroyed, but Elias had learned one thing. The only true way to defeat it was to outlast it, to refuse to surrender. And so, with the lighthouse behind him and the storm in front, Elias faced the unknown, knowing that the island's curse was not a force to be broken. It was one to be endured.